that I should. I don't normally give people a hard time. You don't give me a hard time. That's why you get a lot of credit.
That's on the record now.
Yeah. Turn the light a little higher.
This is the
No.
Beatitudes.
No.
I just say that because I tend to be lazy in my upload. Okay, so I'm going to pass these out just so we're all on the same page. I guess you did. Not everyone is going to need ones. I did 10, so you can all have your own. But this is just referential. The two places that the Beatitudes are in Scripture are in Matthew. The main place is Matthew 3:20 or 3-12, and the second place is Luke. But Luke comes out a little different. So it's a matter of, and again, if we go without going back to the historicity of how the Gospels were put together, Mark is just the short of it is Mark is thought to sort of be the first gospel, and then because there are large parts of Mark in Matthew.
I don't know what it is.
And Matthew has both a good chunk of Mark and some Matthean content, and then that's original or unique to Matthew, like the Beatitudes. And then you also have some stuff from what's called the Q source. And if you remember Bible study, it's this sort of extra biblical, or I guess now it's not extra biblical, it's what informed it. An outside source that was not named, that was sort of the sayings of, and this is where, and I think it's sometimes, again, I think in much of the evangelical tradition in the last century, we sort of hold on to the idea that the gospel, like God was like, Matthew, write this, or just sort of, Matthew sat down in some trance and wrote it down. Well, that's not the case at all. And there are lots of reasons to think that. Stylistic, grammar. So when we deal with these, we're looking at something that is unique to Matthew, and then also what you have in Luke, and I'll go over the overlap. They overlap in 4 in content, but they change a little bit, and we'll look at those together. In fact, since there are some extras, you are using 2, so you can flip back and forth or have one there just so you can look at both of them. Because it might be helpful just to have both, now that I think about it, both sides like sort of parallel together, just so you can see the comparison as we go through them in a few minutes. So yeah, just sort of put the Beatitudes on the other, and for you, 5, 3-12 is where we find it in Matthew, and in the blessings and woes, Luke 6:20 through 26. A couple things just to know. We've been talking about Luke. We've been taking passages from Luke over the last few weeks, and I've sort of done some refreshers just over the last few weeks on what Luke is. Again, physician, intelligent, educated, writing for an educated audience, but writing still to be read aloud. Considered a historical biography, meaning it was ordered in some sense of chronological time sequence. It was meant to portray who Jesus was at large. Matthew, on the other hand, spent probably 30 to 40 years as an oral tradition. It was written before Luke. It was written as in the style of an ancient biography. In other words, it wasn't really meant to be like an eyewitness account of what happened. It was really meant to be something that was handed down. So the oral tradition is strong. But remember, Matthew is written to the Jews. It's the biggest thing, that if you remember nothing about the backgrounds of things, that you remember Luke is written to an educated Greek audience. Matthew is written to a predominantly Jewish-speaking audience, but who could read and understand Greek, but still at the time, not many people were literate. So most of this stuff was read in part or in whole. Right there. Oh, just a reminder, Matthew means gift of God in terms of meaning, but it also represents, similar to the Greek word for disciple in Greek. And so the question becomes, who was Matthew written to? Is it written to a particular person, or was a person particular writing it, or was it written to sort of disciples, sort of saying to the learner, to the disciple? This is for you. But an ancient biography was really meant to capture movement. It was not meant to provide historic authentication. And so it was meant to sort of paint a portrait of a figure. Both in Luke, being a more of a historical account, it was meant to represent the events and activities and experiences and things that happened, whereas Matthew has a little bit more of a portrayal of who Jesus was. So Matthew finds itself concerned much with connecting things to the Old Testament. So the Old Testament connection is much stronger, but without explanation. So sometimes in Luke, when Jewish concepts are introduced, or in John, if a Jewish concept is introduced, there's usually a clause or something after to sort of say, hey, you're a Greek listener, or a non-Jew listener, and so we want to give you, you might need a little bit of framing for that, because if you've never grown up in Jewish tradition, whereas Matthew has an assumed understanding of sort of Jewish background. Again, it was written to Jews. We see that in one of the biggest things is that, and beyond the sort of just assumed knowledge of Jewish history, but also the fact that I like to point out that the story of the Magi is in Matthew is a major piece of identifying what it's doing. And that means that the reason is, maybe in whole, but I don't really know. But for the Jews to hear that foreign astrologers came to Jerusalem to honor a Jewish king as something more than, that's not in their worldview. You're taking possibly, when you look at the Magi, you look at, they say Persian, Indian, and Asian. Now, we don't know. And the truth is there probably were a lot more than three. I hate to bust your bubble, but if you thought that, our nativity sets probably need another dozen or more. But it was like there were a lot of foreign astrologers or magicians who came in and were following and saw this as a sign. And when that star appeared, there's an aberration. But the fact that they were acknowledging this cosmic quality of Christ's birth is significant to the Jews. Jesus's language and attention to proclamation in Matthew is slightly different than some of the other Gospels. The emphasis on John the Baptist and the repentance is a very strong emphasis in terms of Jesus was there. He wasn't going first to the Gentiles, and that was the new church. That was the New Testament church. Jesus' largely his ministry was the Jewish people in the house of Israel. The forgotten ones, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost prodigal son sort of thing, flipping that sort of narrative on the Pharisees on its head. But keep in mind that when he was out there, particularly on in the events of Jesus' life after his birth, you have this large gap where we know nothing. You see him in the temple at 12, and then all of a sudden he emerges at the time of baptism. John the Baptist, a person is seen, and Jesus is baptized. And for many theologians, and I would put myself in that category, I think that Jesus's superpowers were given to him at baptism, or knowledge of them. Not that, but I think that there always is a self-limiting nature in terms of God's interaction with us. But the fact that Jesus then, or they were bestowed upon him at the end of the temptation, but I do think that supernatural warfare that went on between Satan and Jesus required something more in terms of his spirit. I also, as I was looking at that, when we were talking about the whole angel thing, and that Jesus changing water into wine, commanding in some sense in his mind angels to do this rather than, in other words, if Jesus is the commander of the angels, this makes even more sense why when Jesus is being tempted to throw himself down and Satan says the angels will come attend to you. I think that, but the angels will come, and there's a sense of Jesus. The angels are at Jesus's beck and call. They're there to minister. And so the question is, if Jesus threw himself off the tower, off the hill and fell, and would he be caught? Would he defy the sense of logic? Well, yeah, because the angels would defy that. So when Jesus calmed the storms, is that Jesus doing, or is that sort of, so Jesus had power at this point, and so the minute he hits his powers, comes out of the wilderness, he goes in and he makes some water into wine, and then he goes out and he starts teaching and healing. And everyone's loving it because they're all waiting for this coming king. And at that point, Jesus was just starting off as a rabbi, and he's well respected in teaching, but he's healing people and doing things. Now, in the mindset, and this is important to understand, even in this place here, the Pharisees at first, were curious. They weren't against Jesus until later on. So there's interest, probably reserved interest, but what's going on? Here's a man who's healing, here's casting out demons, he's making proclamations that we're uncomfortable with, but they were sort of watching and waiting. And this passage really is a hinge point in particular for Matthew in terms of just flipping some of the narratives, because everyone up to this point is waiting for the military leader to come on a horse and to overthrow the Roman government and to allow Jews to be, to reign in this sort of powerful kingdom of their own. And that wasn't going to happen. There are 8 blessings in Matthew 5, and 4 of them overlap in Luke 6, and we'll go over those in a minute. But the 8 blessings are sort of considered standard for scholars, although if you look at the Beatitudes one from Matthew, verse 11 and 12, actually you put a little line there or something between those, because that actually represents a 9 often disputed beatitude, in that it does start in the same way, blessed, but it doesn't follow the same pattern. Now the pattern is poetic for us, but that's because we're not familiar with Jewish literature. So sort of Jewish words or sayings would have sort of been put. I don't know if you want to call it there's a blessed are these people, and then a result. This is what will happen to this. It is futuristic. It's not necessarily calm in the moment. In the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation that happened around the 4th century, the word for blessed was beati, which means happy, rich, or blessed. But what's interesting about it is it's considered a plural adjective. And its adjectival form is meant to be in the plural, so it's not an individual. Like these aren't individual blessings that we receive or someone receives as a they're communal. I think concepts sort of grasp meant larger swath. Despite the we were having this new formulation system where we were meeting one-on-one, it was still a communal thing. And then you'll see that same pattern a little bit, even though there are 8 in Luke. You have 4 up top that are the blessed R's, and then you have but the woes, and we'll come to that in a minute. But that's and they kind of go together in the sense of it's still capturing that same sense of Jewish poetry. Now, the question I have, when just looking at the comparison between these two, is why, if Luke was written after Matthew, why did he not, get all the Beatitudes? Where were the other missing 4 in his rendition? You think that, but what that tells me, or what that tells us, because it was written later, was that it wasn't as if Matthew was like, hey, we have a book, let's hand it around and distribute everyone Matthew. Because if that was the case, then Matthew was a source for part of Luke, and Luke was drawing from this, Luke would have drawn from all of this. So clearly Luke didn't have all of them. Again, adding to the idea that some of these things have been pieced together over the years. And I believe Spirit leads in that process of piecing together, but to suggest that they're just written, that's as incongruent. So and the other side of it is these, although they do have it in a similar time frame and in a similar narrative, but that also could be preserved more in an oral tradition than in a written one if it's not recorded at the moment, is that these could be 2 totally different sort of sermons. And my opinion would be that they, I have a couple themes in my preaching that come out all the time. So Jesus probably too. And because you have the Beatitudes, him on a mountain. It starts with crowds. He went up to the mountain and he sat down, and the mountain type thing. And Jesus inside with him. And so you have this idea. Jesus, I should have pointed out the earlier verses on. It says, and in some that was where the one you have one, one you have what's the word you sort of beatific. So yes, picture on the mountain, you man wearing a white robe, blue slash, or like that, you go and all this.
You cut now. I could at least hear it. It's hard to get in. Did we lose him?
I'm not getting anything.
Did we lose everything?
Yeah.
It's too bad.
You want to try to redo it?
Hmm?
You want to try to redo it, whatever you do?
Well, how to